press. Now, the approach of the press, I think, was best articulated by that philosopher, Michael Corleone, in which he described for the victims of violence and unfair dealing that it's just business. And I think the legislators make a mistake in thinking that the press is after them or unfair to them. I think it is just business. Now, the nature of this business, however, has become quite prosecutorial. John Meacham, who is the editor of Newsweek magazine, I heard him recently, and he said that what we need to do, we the press need to do, is to get to these elected officials early while they're desperate for attention and get them on the record so we can use it later. And we need to get people inside that we can have information to use on them. And I thought, what a wonderfully candid observation, very revealing. Jon Stewart, which is where I get most of my current affairs information. By the way, it's interesting to me that comedians are now a more fruitful source of public affairs information than any other source. But in any event, Jon Stewart interviewing David Frost, Sir David Frost, he made a point of mentioning, on the subject of Frost's interview of David Nixon. And a compelling phrase for me was Jon Stewart saying, you know, David, you were wonderfully prosecutorial. He didn't mean that in an ironic way. He was genuinely admiring of the press as prosecutor. The other thing about the legislature and the press is that it's very, very difficult for the legislature, or any group actually, to communicate effectively with a consistent and coherent message. Unlike the executive, who can call a press conference at will and control the message, any legislative leader who gets up and purports to speak for the 100 members of his caucus, or God forbid, you know, the 203 members of the House, is really quite at risk, because it will turn out that there is significant diversity of opinion there. So with the exception perhaps of Newt Gingrich with the Contract for America, there has been very, very few across the country, arguably across the world, leaders of groups or institutions that have been able to communicate effectively. So in part, the difficulty with the press is on their side. The final contextual element for the legislature is the fact that you don't need to hear much about because you know it as well as I do, and that is that the world has really changed. I mean, Wall Street greed and dysfunction has created an economic disaster in this country, and people are now looking to government to resolve that problem. I think it's fair to say that the political center in this country has moved to the left. And I think it's also fair to say that the changes in the technology of communication are nothing less than revolutionary. The idea that the president-elect would be on a medium, I think it was YouTube. I looked to the next generation, my wife, for a cue on that. I've never even seen YouTube, but apparently, you know, that is indicative of the technological change. And so all that at the same time, those are the contextual elements. Internal to the legislature, there are a whole series of challenges. One is, and this is I think the most prominent challenge, is to change the culture of the body itself. You know, as I mentioned, there's always, even in the good old days when I was there was always this tension between solving problems and the spoils system. But the culture now has shifted way, way out of whack. And the first challenge for this legislature is going to be to move that back to problem solving and away from the notion that every man, woman, every man for himself, and without an identity with the caucus or the party or the institution of the legislature itself. Second challenge is to initiate policy. There's a great book by the leading scholar on the subject, Alan Rosenthal, which book, by the way, has recently arrived on the desks of every legislative leader in the United States, including those in Pennsylvania. So I commend Rosenthal's book to their attention. And one of the points that Rosenthal makes in terms of how you evaluate a legislature, what a legislature ought to be doing institutionally, is to initiate policy. Otherwise, you get run over by the executive branch, you get run over by the outside forces. Third issue, the quality of the work product. It is essential, because you are making law, it is essential to create a quality work product from a craftsman point of view. To do that, you need to use your staff well, you need to use your members well. When we were doing the environmental legislation way back after the Federal Clean Air Act, et cetera, we had excellent staff, and we recruited members. A fellow named Dick Hayden, who was an environmental lawyer at the time, member of the House, got recruited into the process of the drafting and the crafting of that legislation. And it was understood that no matter where you came out on the political spectrum, or where you came out on the issue of environmental controls, et cetera, the quality of the work that we did as legislators was absolutely key. Next challenge internally, to contain the partisanship. Now, in my day, long past, the legislature was a team sport. There was no question about it. You were a Democrat or you were a Republican. And I can't claim any moral superiority. Well, A, because I'm a lawyer, but because the good old days were good, but they weren't perfect. And in terms of partisanship, I did blocking and tackling for Jim Mandarino, and who was a volcanic and dominating presence, a man with very, very defined points of view. And when we went to the floor, you can be sure that there was partisanship there. And I've also, in another iteration, gone toe-to-toe with a fellow named Matt Ryan, who was a man that I admired deeply. He was the Republican leader. We went toe-to-toe on Democrat versus Republican. But I have to say that despite that partisanship, there was an overall commitment to civility, there was no hatefulness, and there was a very conscious understanding that at the end of the day, our obligation was to govern. And that overrode considerations of partisanship. The next challenge, I think, is, and there are many, but I'll stop here. The next challenge, I think, is to present for the folks a debate on the great issues. I recall debating abortion, the abortion issue, with Steve Friend. And Steve was a man of passion, and he was a man deeply, deeply committed to a point of view. But that debate, and being across from Steve Friend, you knew that while this debate was being watched, regardless of the level of your commitment, regardless of your point of view, this debate was useful for everyone who had a chance to hear it, not just in the House, but also in the larger electorate. So to present the great issues of the day and to debate them in a way that the public says, yes, this is what democracy is about, is an enormous challenge, and I think it presents itself now. In more specific terms, there are certain